So slots clearly are an important feature. They give us way more flexibility and allow us to do things which we can't really do or which we can't really build without slots. Now, I'm not done with slots though. There is more we can cover about them. For example, you can provide default slot content. So with that, I don't mean that you have a default, an unnamed slot where content will go that doesn't target a different name, but I mean that if you have a slot which receives no content, that this slot can then render some default content. For example, here in the header, we can add default content by adding content between our slot tags here. Let's say a h2 tag here, where I say that default, just to show how this works. It doesn't make a lot of sense for this specific component, but you definitely can have components where some default content might make sense. Now, if you add such an element, if you add content between your slot tags, by default, this will not be visible right now, because all the places where I use the base card do provide content for the header slot. Both the badge list as well as the user info component both provide content for the header. But let's say the badge list wouldn't have its vslot header template here, so it doesn't provide any content for the header slot. If you remove that, you see now the default in that component, because now the slot fallback content, the default content of that slot, is being shown. And that, of course, can be useful for certain components. Now, we can argue if it's useful for this specific component, though. Why should a card, which should just act as a wrapper that gives us some visual styling, why should that have a default title? After all, you don't know what the content that will be passed into the card will be about. So rendering some default title probably doesn't make a lot of sense. I'll still leave it here for reference, but of course it is just an example. But you can, in such cases where you don't know if you really need that slot element here, you can also use another nice feature. If we wouldn't render this default fallback content, our badge list card doesn't have any title. But if we inspect the HTML markup, we of course see it has an empty header element. And whilst we don't see that on the screen, this is not ideal semantically. Having an empty HTML element lying around in the DOM, I don't know, I don't want to have that. You can utilize another cool feature here. In the component where you define slots, you get a special property provided by Vue. We can see it if I add the mounted lifecycle here. Let's then console log this $slots. $slots is another built-in property provided by Vue, and it holds information about the slot data this component receives for its different slots. So if I save that, open the developer tool, and there the JavaScript console, and reload, we see two console logs here. Why do we see two? Because we're using our component that has slots twice. We're using it in user info and we're using it in badge list. So every time this component is getting used, mounted is getting called, because this base card component gets created and mounted twice. Obviously, since we use it twice, and therefore we get this console log twice. Now, the interesting thing is, in those objects, we have access to the different slots we're providing. So we can actually access .header here because we have a slot named header here. We could also access .default because we have a default slot. Now, if I access .header, we'll see something interesting. If I reload again, we also see two outputs in the end, this one, and we see two outputs for the same reason as explained before. But the interesting thing is that we see this strange output here once, but that we see undefined the other time. Now, undefined here is coming from the usage of this base card component in the badge list component. There, we're not providing content for the header slot, And therefore, in base card component, when I try to access this provided content, so to say, I get undefined when this base card component gets created for the badge list. And now that's something we can utilize here. On this header element, we could add vIf and check if slots header is truthy. So if it's undefined, it will be falsy, and therefore this header element will not be rendered. So if I now save that and reload, we get the same log. But if I inspect this badge list component, you now see the header is gone. And that's just, of course, a minor improvement. It's also definitely a bit more advanced, but I hope you understand what we're doing here. With $sign slots, we can check whether we do receive data for a specific slot, and if we don't, we could use that information to not render a certain element. The header still works fine in the user info component. There, the base card outputs the header, because there, for the usage of base card in user info, we do provide content for the header. It's just the usage and badge list, where we also use base card, where we don't provide header content, where therefore we remove the header. That's how we could use this $sign slots information. And now there's one additional thing about slots which I also want to mention. In the places where you use the component that offers slots, so in our case in badge list and user info, we do provide slot content with this template and the vslot directive. Just as for vbind and von, there is a shorthand for vslot. You can absolutely write it like this, but you can also replace it with a hash symbol. So hash header also means the same as vslot : header. And that's simply a bit shorter. We can do the same here for the default slot, and of course we can also do the same in the badge list and target the default like that. So we can write this in a bit of a shorter way, and with that we get the same output as before. We got no error, everything works, but now we're using this shorthand here.